This is where the rubber hits the road for our economies. And this is the stuff that sits behind the code words that slip from Osborne and Darling's mouths about what we've got to do in the future. So when you hear those little placed stories about the consultants saying the NHS needs 10% staff, here's why. In 2008, gross government debt in Canada, France, Germany, and the United Kingdom, as a percentage of gross domestic product, we weren't too bad. We looked like we had 52% of our gross domestic product was represented by government debt. We were relatively under-borrowed compared to other countries. Now, that's a wee bit of a fudge because of PFI and PPI, PPP and things like that, where we've put infrastructure projects into the hands of the private sector, which doesn't show up in the government balance sheet. But this column here is the IMF's forecast of where that public debt will be by the time we go through the current borrowing binge that governments are doing. Because they're borrowing money to keep demand in the economy because households are saving instead of borrowing again. Now, here's the stats that make it interesting. If you take that number as the numerator and that as the denominator, in Canada that's a 20% increase, 30% in Germany, 14%, ours has gone up by 40. Not 40 percentage points, but it's 40% higher. And more importantly, the financial stabilization costs, in other words, how much of our GDP are we spending to prop up our financial system? 5% in Canada, 3% in Germany, 9% here, and 13% there. This is the price for rampant, unfettered, light-touch regulation in the city and Wall Street. And we're going to pay this for a long time to come. And I suspect it's significantly higher interest rates. Now, we are here in September of 2009, benefiting from the colossal amounts of money being pumped in by the US government, British government, German government. That's why all these debt numbers have gone up. So if you increase, I mean, there's not a single number here below 14, 15%. So all these economies have borrowed money and they're chucking it at the economy. So the reason why the economy is higher just now is absolutely because of public sector. It is not to do with consumers. How many of you have increased your expenditure in the last 12 months? Right. So we know that's happening. It's the public sector that's held it up. The intellectual theories being advanced as to why that's happening are called Keynesian. I'm not enough of an economist to know whether that's legitimate or not, but I do know enough economists who feel that's a traducing of the great man's name and what was intended. Because in the 1930s, we started from a share of the public sector as a much smaller share of the economy. We're now starting from it being a colossal share of the economy, particularly here in the UK. And the return of Gladstonian liberal economics is something that I would be very pleased to see in terms of how we run our affairs. The reason why I believe that the hubris has gone out is that I think, although there's profit being made, if you read Stephen Hester I think is a very impressive individual, the chap who's running RBS, and he's got an extremely difficult job, and if you read carefully what he said in the statements issued since he took the job, I think he did 3 or 4 announcements. He's saying, slow and steady, there are no green shoots. Yes, our trading book is up, because we're being given cheap money by the government, which means we can sell things we wouldn't otherwise sell. But if you look at our core book of business in lending and deposit taking, that's really tough. So that's what I mean. I think we're in an era now where the puff of oxygen has made the patient, it's like a steroid for a dying person. It's that puff of energy, but now at some point the government's funding will run out and we'll be faced with the harsh reality of what the long term is. So the concern, Jim, is that this is not a destination, but this is merely a waypoint. And the concern is that we might wind up with Japanese levels of public debt because we keep trying. If you Google Japan and talk about roads to nowhere, one of the things you'll see is that the Japanese government started building roads to link the different islands and different parts of the country that were rural, and they paved riverbeds. Now, you and I might agree that dueling the A9 might be a really good idea. And why not duel it to Stornoway and build a bridge and all that sort of stuff. But there comes a point in the Japanese experience, there's no guarantee that that's a paradigm for us, but there came a point where it didn't have an effect in the economy. So this is just an illustration of 2010, but in 2 years, to borrow that much more, boy, it better stop. And that's why Osborne and Darling, and actually Alistair Darling looks like the most relaxed man in the world now. he knows he's not going to be in government, he's probably going to lose his seat. And he's actually, unusually, he's in that happy pace where he can, in fact, take serious decisions for the long term because he knows he won't have to live with the consequences. I think a lot of the things that he's been saying are very apt of late. And Osborne is under pressure because he's got to address some of these issues. And I think there's just a concern that the UK's borrowing would get out of control. You are old enough to remember Dennis Healey being pulled back from the airplane in 1977. So our folk memory is of getting this stuff wrong. And what Japan got away with, Jim, and I won't bore you with the details of the fine stuff, but Japan did this without inflation. Because Japanese people save enough. All of that debt is held in Japan. A lot of that debt is held outside the UK. And what is the guy from China who's asked, please can we have 10 billion more at our treasury auction, because we need this money to jewel the A9. And the Chinese guy says, absolutely no trouble. And the British government official says, that's great, 3%. And the Chinese guy says, actually no, 7. You don't want to be owning sterling that day. These are colossal challenges for the future. And candidly, I mean, I'm happy to grant you Chatham House rules here. I'd love to know what you think about it, because we cannot continue as we are. We have a really new system to come up with in terms of the relationship between the state and the individual, and what we expect from the state in terms of what's considered our rights and our obligations back to in a very clear fiscal and taxation means. Actually, I think it's hugely exciting, because it gives us a chance, because actually we did our best work when times were tough. So I think that the benefit of this is it's going to shake us down and make us think about the really fundamental questions about the relationship between our income, our expenditures, and what we get from government. So that's why I think the hubris is gone. I think all we're doing is it's the last, since I've never smoked cannabis in my entire life, not even close to inhaling it, I have no idea what it's like to come off a high. But I imagine we're in that high just now from all that money being pumped in. And when the government says we can't go higher on the borrowing, that's when the fun starts. And my guess is 2010, 11 and onwards is going to be a real grind. It won't make us worse. Probably help us make much more serious choices. I think the public sector's got a big challenge there.